Ladies and gentlemen, let's Gaming Telecom video. We're going to be taking a look at AMD's roadmap of graphics and CPU, as well as some virtual reality stuff they've discussed as well. Now, we will also be getting, finally tomorrow, into the more server-orientated and also APU, which also discusses their console endeavours. And after that as well, we'll take a look at Nvidia stuff, because Nvidia are also releasing a lot of their information. So that's kind of cool. But I want to do AMD first, since, well, there's a lot of movement regarding their Zen processors and so on. Plus, as a couple of people know, if you've been reading Facebook, I also had a discussion with AMD today on the phone. So I can also throw in a few comments there as well. So let's begin, shall we? I figure that's a really good plan. This is also an article. If you want to check out some of the slides, if you want to kind of share it with your friends, I'd greatly appreciate it. So let's begin. So, the investment conference, the Financial Analyst Day conference, was pretty darn interesting. For a start, we learned that HBM high bandwidth memory is a thing with the R9 390X. We'll get more into that in just a moment. And we also learned something regarding Bulldozer, in that it's going to have a roughly 40% performance IPC over the previous generation of CPUs. But there's a heck of a lot more that AMD are also getting into. So the first thing that's going to be pretty darn evident is that some 300 range GPUs are out, but they are, for all intents and purposes, rebrands of the previous generation. Now, don't get too discouraged. It's not a bad thing. All it is basically AMD making use of the technology they've got. Rebrands are very typical in the industry. In this case, they're going to be utilizing the long-rumored Tonga Pro, which is, you can basically think of it as a 285. These are primarily GPUs that are aimed for OEM. Whether they're going to get retail releases, at least at the time I'm recording this, is a bit ambiguous. It's possible that if we do see retail releases, their specifications may change. There might be higher amount of core clock or something like that. Sometimes that does happen. So what they'll do is they'll basically do a little bit of speed binning for retail versions versus OEM. It has happened in the past. 3DFX did it. They were one of the first companies to do it, and I'm sure it's going to happen more. But effectively, let's say the 380, it's basically the same as the 285. It's still got 1792 cores. It's running at roughly the same clock speed, 918. Obviously, this does depend on manufacturer. The main difference is it's got 4 GB of GDDR5 memory, but it's still running at 176 GB. So in short, you've got more VRAM, 2 GB for the 285 versus 4. But aside from that, all of the parts are also pretty, you're going to recognize them. It's not a bad thing, it's a little disappointing, but it also does make sense because it makes those parts for OEMs in particular considerably cheaper. Moving away from the rebrand side of things, let's actually care about the stuff, well, focus on the stuff rather that we care about. God, you can tell I just basically been surviving on coffee today. Anyway, you can basically pretty much guess that most people care about the R9 390X since it's the highest range card. And as AMD are putting it, it's effectively aimed at virtual reality and 4K displays. This card is going to be beastly. It is the first card with high bandwidth memory, which is going to be really interesting. HBM1 is going to be used for the card, as I'm probably guessing you've heard by now. HBM2 is supposedly going to be for the next iteration of the GCN architecture, known as Arctic Islands, but we don't know too much about Arctic Islands. All we know is it's going to be a considerable improvement in power and performance compared to the 300 series. But it's not to say the 300 series is going to be bad, it's just that they're going to be moving to a new FinFET process and also going to have HBM2, which is going to be kind of cool. But keeping with HBM1 and more to the point, the 390X, in other words, stuff that's going to be released this year, it will be running at 640 GB per second bandwidth if the calculations we've been hearing numerous places are accurate. We do know that it's going to be running on 1024-bit bus per chip, which means it's going to be at least 4096-bit interface. So assuming the modest clocks that we're hearing are accurate, which I would be shocked if they're not, we're looking at least 640 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, which is insane. To give you an indication of what that is, the PS4 is 176 gigabytes of bandwidth. This is the same as the 380 OEM or the 285. To give you another indication, high-end GPUs, let's say the 780, the 780 Ti, the 980, the 290, the 290X, obviously they all slightly differ, but they're all in the high-end 200s or low 300 gigabytes per second. This is literally double that. And it's a good indication of what we need to be, really, to power the next generation of GPUs. And this is regardless of whether we're looking at AMD or Nvidia. There's only a certain amount of data that you can process before you start getting, basically stuck. You're basically starving the GPU of actually data. To give you a really simple example, this has actually happened back in the original GeForce days as well, when we were utilizing SDR memory, and then there was an absolute massive speed up when Nvidia switched to DDR. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not blaming Nvidia on that one. It just turned out that DDR chips at the start were extremely prohibitively expensive and also very difficult to manufacture. But when Nvidia did get to utilize DDR, it really opened up the architecture of the GeForce graphics card. And the same thing theoretically should happen here. Even cards which we have, sometimes if you reduce the clock speed on the core a little bit, you'll notice that performance is pretty linear. But contrary to that, if you increase the the memory clock, you'll notice performance goes up. It just depends if the game is bandwidth starved, but obviously it does depend on application and the GPU's architecture. Moving on from that, we don't know exactly what the specifications for the GPU are going to be. Rumor has it still 4096, which is not the bit interface, but this time the number of shaders, the ALUs if you prefer, and around 1 gigahertz. Now, this is based on a SysSoft Sandra database entry where that's precisely what we saw. It didn't mention whether this is like a final version of the card, and naturally, your mileage may vary whether you want to believe that or not. And we also don't know, let's say, little details like the number of ROPs. So all we can do is shrug. Supposedly that variant had 4 gigabytes of VRAM as well, but obviously there are 8 gigabytes models which possibly will be emerging. Moving on to Liquid VR. Now, Liquid VR is a middleware. It's an SDK designed to reduce latency and improve motion tracking and other bits and bobs, which are associated, of course, with virtual reality. Virtual reality is a thing which is not going to be going away. Nvidia, I had a quick look at their own investor relations stuff, and they're also talking about VR, but I haven't gone super into it at the moment. All companies are getting into it. I mean, there's even talk that Electronic Arts are going to be possibly jumping into VR, which will be very interesting. Valve, of course, will be, and we all know about, the Oculus Rift. I've actually tested out Oculus Rift using DK2, that's Development Kit 2. In other words, it's not quite the latest iteration, but it's quite far along. And there's a problem with it, and that is motion sickness. At least I experience it, and a couple of friends who have tried it around my house, same deal. I was actually speaking to AMD today regarding Liquid VR, and effectively it's going to be kind of cool. It works quite simply. It farms out work via the ACEs, the asynchronous compute engines, which we've discussed ad nauseum on the channel, so I won't really go into how they work. But it basically schedules compute tasks in bubbles in the rendering pipeline. In other words, in times where there's no work, just because of how graphics and computer graphics work, even with DirectX 12, there's tiny little micro parts where the GPU's not doing anything. We're talking just a few seconds of processing. Well, not a few seconds, but you know what I mean. And basically you'll find that some graphics tasks are not necessarily dependent on others. So you might get certain amounts of shaders that, let's say, a very simple example, let's say you have 100 shaders, you might get, say, 90 of those being used for a graphics task, but 10 are free, and therefore compute work can be farmed off to them. Very simple example. Now, if developers utilize this, what it should do is actually farm those compute engines, or farm that compute work off to reduce latency, get more consistent frame rates, which is incredibly important with virtual reality, and also for head tracking and other bits and bobs that are associated with virtual reality as a whole. That is very important. I do feel that some of the nausea that I felt personally did have to do with the fact it was an early version, and obviously the screen resolutions aren't quite where they need to be. Hopefully eventually we'll be using like 4K displays for virtual reality or something ridiculous, but for now, obviously, 1080p is really what they're aiming for, slightly higher than that, at a decent frame rate per thing. And moving slightly onto DirectX 12 just for a second, and way off of AMD, one of the benefits with DirectX 12 is, of course, the IGP, integrated graphics card. Let's say you've got an Intel rig, let's say you're running an i5 with a built-in GPU. Well, what that can go ahead and do is farm off the graphics work, post-processing, or some virtual reality stuff like, say, the warping or what have you, to the IGP. So that's also kind of one route to go. It'll be a curious thing. But anyway, this, getting back to Liquid VR, it will, of course, be high resolutions in stereo. That's how they're, how can I put it? That's how they're touting it, and it's going to be reduced to the latency. Motion to photon latency of less than 10 milliseconds is what they're promising. But just how accurate it is, or how many developers use it, I don't know. From my understanding with conversations with them, and from kind of doing some digging around, it will depend on the developer. It's not going to be something that, is just necessarily automatic. I imagine it will also come down to some game engine stuff as well, by which I mean, some game engines are going to be considerably easier to maybe integrate it. Let's say the usual suspects like Unity, probably going to be plugins for Unreal and so on, so that won't be too much of a big deal. But if it's your own game engine and you don't have much experience, you might have some problems. But if you're fairly confident with 3D code already, and you've gone ahead and developed most of the stuff yourself, you probably won't have much problems integrating the SDK. But it's more going to be tweaking for the performance side of things that could be a problem. But obviously everything's really early, so things are going to improve over time anyway, just naturally. And obviously a lot of this will be utilizing asynchronous shading techniques for DirectX, but we've gone into a lot of that stuff before. There are links to it in the article if you do want to check it out, because I don't, it's not that I want to abbreviate this stuff to kind of screw you guys over, but at the same time I've discussed it a couple of times, so I don't want to keep repeating the same points because it's boring for regular viewers. So I think it's good just to kind of have like an intermediate mix. So I've talked about the 400 series. Roughly the bandwidth is going to be double for the 400 series. Rather the high bandwidth memory 2, it's going to be using 2 gigabits per second per pin. So you're looking per chip at 256 gigabytes per second, which is just insanity, to be totally honest. Absolute insanity. Max bandwidth per pin on HBM1 is 1 gigabits per second, which is, it's still insane considering, compared to, let's say, 28 gigabytes per second for GDDR5. So 28 versus 128 or 256, that's pretty impressive. What about Zen? Well, Zen is a bit of a strange one. AMD do freely admit, I mean, not just to me, but to anyone, that, their single core performance, or single thread performance actually, isn't quite where it needs to be. Multi-threading, the CPU performs really well as certain other tasks, but in actual single-thread performance, it doesn't quite live up to where maybe they'd hoped. On the other hand, Zen, from what I'm hearing, will be completely radical change. Now, there were reports of Zen even back in 2013. There were murmurs and whispers, but of course, no one really knew anything about it other than, oh, a CPU is coming out, and there also was not a name for it, at least as far as I'm aware. No one called it Zen, at least as far as I know. But Zen has a couple of things. Firstly, it's a totally new design. It will support simultaneous multi-threading for high throughput. Those are PRE terms. Basically, we're looking at 40% performance increase IPC. There are a few questions on exactly how that's going to be achieved, and whether that's for the total amounts of cores, whether it's going to be, for all of the CPU, whether it's per thread or what have you. But even in the worst case scenario, it's going to be considerably better than what we have now. There's also a much improved high bandwidth low latency caching system. It's a good thing, to be totally honest, because while Bulldozer and its ilk weren't particularly bad with caching, it was a bit of a weak point. Oh, and a slight aside, Zen Plus is going to take what Zen has and improve on it. But we have so little information on Zen Plus, it's just like, yeah, we're going to take what we have and we're going to improve it. Well, okay, but, that could be the equivalent of, I don't know, Skylake. Well, maybe not Skylake, because that's slightly better. But let's go with Sandy Bridge to Ivy Bridge. I think that's a better comparison. In other words, it could be very, very subtle, very, very small, and we might not actually really feel it, or it could be pretty damn big. We just don't know at the moment. Most of the changes come from Zen in two ways. The first is that you're going to be looking at a large amount of level 3 cache. Is going to be 8 megabytes per Zen block, which we'll get into in just a second, and each of the processors, each individual processor, 512 kilobytes, which is not too bad. Now, regarding how Zen actually is put together, it's a little weird. A Zen module is comprised of 4 CPU cores. Now, what you'll have is then a high-speed interconnect for each of those quad-core modules. So in short, you might have a desktop CPU that has 8 CPU cores, and it's based on 2 of these Zen modules together. So in short, you'll have 16 megabytes of level 3 cache, just for example. So you can kind of see how that all interconnects, and the performance is going to be very impressive. I've had a few people asking me regarding hyperthreading and what type of performance we're going to be getting, and a few other questions, but obviously no one's going to talk to us at the moment. I have arranged some discussions with AMD in the future when that stuff comes out, so that'll be kind of cool. Finally, and all of this stuff is rumoured, because including some of the last stuff I talked to about regarding, say, even the amount of cache on the CPU, because at the end of the day, most of this stuff comes from leaks. It is all in the article, including my sources, but at the end of the day, it's not been confirmed by AMD. But there are also going to be some changes regarding floating point instructions. Supposedly, it will be able to support up to a 512-bit float. This is based on how the previous generation, for example, Excavator worked, where you can have 228-bit FMAX. Those 228-bit FMAX could process either 228 bits in the instructions a clock cycle, or they could actually come together and process a single 256-bit AVX instruction. So, because Zen supposedly has 2 FMAX, which are 256-bit, the rumour has it that they can support up to a 512-bit float per clock. Whether that's accurate, I don't know. I don't want to tell you it is. The rumours and the leaked slides, which look kind of close and kind of accurate from the other slides, they kind of tells me that's possible. But obviously, once again, I don't want to tell you it's accurate, and it's not. So what about other bits and bobs? Well, AMD at the end of the day are also transitioning a lot of server stuff, which we will get into. They've also discussed some stuff regarding the PlayStation 4 and the next generation consoles, and they are also talking, of course, about high resolution graphics work, for example, using stuff like the Fire Pro series. But we're going to discuss this in a different video because I have a feeling that that information is going to appeal, especially when it comes to server information, to a very different audience. And also, I don't want to make this video like a 50-minute lecture. I'm going to finish this off by saying, once again, I will be covering Nvidia stuff and other bits and bobs over the next couple of days because there's a heck of a lot of stuff that's been coming out on the tech market right now. I know a lot of you are getting patient regarding the Vulkan stuff. We were actually supposed to be filming the Tech Simplified on Friday, but as it turns out, because we have to use a studio and it's basically a friend's studio, I won't go into specific details because it's his personal life, but effectively he wasn't around in the area. So we've had to reschedule. So hopefully it'll either be this Monday we go in and film, or it'll be Friday, next Friday. So I don't know when you guys are going to get it. We do have something else in mind, kind of like a live discussion of Amata and I, so we will be putting that up anyway. But if I'm going to be doing this simplified thing, I'm hopefully going to make it a weekly thing eventually once we get it down. It's a bit weird for me because I have to actually write the script. And I'm usually better at improving, to be totally honest. But I'm sure it will get down and it'll be kind of cool. And we're also hoping to transition a lot of our reviews like this as well. Not simplified format, in a just kind of a more recorded and, how can I put it? A more scripted and more kind of professional layout. But that's in the future. Over the next couple of weeks we'll be sorting all this stuff out. There's a lot of ins and outs. We might also be testing some more lighting setups at my place. But just because of how everything works, it's not ideal. But we'll try it out at our own time. But for now, I'm going to let you guys go. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.